Hello and welcome to Zagat Guest Chefs at Google. I'm Chef Jim Dodge, and today we have a very special guest, culinary historian Erica Peters, and she's here today to talk about her book, San Francisco, A Food Biography. Erica has a bachelor's degree from Harvard in history and literature, and she has a doctorate in history from the University of Chicago. Her first book was Appetites and Aspirations in Vietnam, Food and Drink in the 19th Century. She's also the director of the Culinary Historians in Northern California.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You know, most people think that in San Francisco that the good food started in the 70s and 80s, but what you've unfolded in this book is the real history of cuisine in Northern California and San Francisco. And it's fascinating how you start with the Native Americans and work your way through the historic events, the immigration of different cultures, and you unfold a foundation of what it made it possible for the revolution in food in the 90s and 80s.
The wonderful thing about being in the San Francisco Bay Area is that the traditions of great cuisine go all the way back to the gold rush, maybe even further to the missions and the Native Americans who used whatever local resources were available, because of course that's what they had. But they made delicious foods out of it, and so did the people cooking for the gold miners in 1849. And from then to now, we've had delicious food. So it's a wonderful place to study food history.
The book so impressed me. I mean, it must have been it shows a tremendous amount of research. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, so I had started the group, the Culinary Historians of Northern California, to get a support system in place when I was writing the first book, the book about Vietnam that you mentioned. And I met so many wonderful people running the group. We would get in speakers to come talk about their research in food history. And eventually I got my book written, which was very satisfying. But I would get calls from reporters saying, so you run this group, the Culinary Historians of Northern California, you must know about gold rush cuisine, you must know about what the refugees ate after the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. And I would say, well, no, I work on Vietnam. And also, there's no one in my group who works on that. And there isn't a really good book that I can give you to read because nobody has written it. So after I took that phone call a few times, I started to think maybe there's a market here for that book. Maybe there's interest in it. And it became obvious once I had that idea in my head that it needed to get written so that I could tell people to read the book. And so then the same publisher, actually, as my first book, was putting out a series of books on the food history of different U.S. cities, New York, Chicago, New Orleans, and they wanted to do San Francisco. And I said, I'll do that.
One of the first things I noticed in the book was a quote from one of my favorite American food authors, MFK Fisher, who was raised in Southern California. And she was asked the question how to explain California cuisine. This was in the 80s. And her response is, it's what we've always had. We just want more of it now.
Yeah.
And I thought that really summed up a lot, particularly what you put together here in this book.
Thank you. Yeah, the great thing about the gold rush was it brought people so quickly from all over the world, and they were interested in each other's foods because you come back from the mines and you want a quick way to show everyone how successful you were in gold mining. And so going to a fine restaurant and introducing people to the wonderful foods that you can afford was a great way of showing off, of conspicuously consuming in front of your friends and your rivals. And the interesting thing is that there was this brief moment when people did not eat the local food because they didn't know so much about that, and there were no farmers producing. Everyone wanted to be a miner, not a farmer. So at the very beginning, in 1848, 1849, they were eating mostly canned foods. But the canned foods were wonderful canned foods. They were brought in from all over. So it was an odd moment, but it was cosmopolitan and exotic, but also shipped in from China, shipped in from Boston. eggs in San Francisco were about $1 an egg because nobody was doing chicken farming. So they would bring eggs all the way around Cape Horn from Boston. And so 4-month-old eggs cost a quarter, which was a deal if a fresh egg cost $1. But that's what was behind the dish Hangtown Fry, which is really just an oyster and egg scramble. But it was oysters and eggs were very expensive, so you felt like you were showing off if you could offer someone a dish like that. And those were made with fresh eggs, not with the 4-month-old eggs.
Then you explain how things changed, particularly when the Transcontinental Railroad came through, and then there was a focus on agriculture here.
That's
and can
right.
you talk about that a little bit?
That's right, because with the railroad, they could ship now, by train or by ship, the goods that they were growing in California to the rest of the country, and that meant that it was really worth it to invest in agriculture. It was the breadbasket of the country was here for a while, and obviously a lot of produce. There are these fantastic postcards of huge lemons, huge apples, this idea that everything in California was big and impressive and delicious.
And it built quite an industry here, exporting fresh food across the country.
But obviously also for people who were local,
Yes.
It meant that you had such all year round, such wonderful produce. And then the other part about the trains is it brought tourists from the East Coast and from the middle of the country to San Francisco. And they got to experience so that's when San Francisco became known nationally as a great food city.
And you also mentioned the significance of two of the earthquakes, one in the late 1800s and of course the 1906 earthquake. And can you explain how that changed the dynamics and brought together, you mentioned how it brought together the different cultures that were here.
Right. I mean, I think anytime there's a huge disaster like that, it makes people realize how vulnerable they are and how much the communities need each other. So there are a lot of stories from the 1906 earthquake of people from Chinatown figuring out first how to get food, and then the people who had not been in food industries before, they're using their Chinese servants, whoever they know in the Chinese community, is facilitating them having anything to eat at all, which was, I think, seminal in. There was also a movement to change where Chinatown was right after the earthquake because everything had been leveled, and so the people who wanted access to that real estate said, let's move Chinatown further out of the center of town and we can build our own buildings there and have our own resources there. And China stepped in and contacted the federal government and said, no, you're not going to do that. And the Chinese people who lived in Chinatown, some of them were landowners and they have rights just like any other citizen does. But I think also one of the reasons it didn't happen was because people were getting fed by people from that neighborhood, and there was this sense of community there.
The other thing that I found fascinating, again, speaking about local produce, is there was a great pride in the local produce in farmers market. And you talk about the transition of farmers market and then local grocery stores.
There are a number of farmers markets early on, and there's always this tension where the city people think that they should get a deal when they buy directly from the farmer, and the farmer thinks they should get extra money because they've come all the way to the city. And it turns out having a middleman is actually often a good idea, unless you're selling the quaintness of buying directly from the farmer. But I think what farmers markets in San Francisco have always done really well is introduced people to cuisines and to vegetables, produce that they weren't familiar with. So again, the Chinese played a big role here. They would go to both the Chinese and the Italians were really big in growing the foods, the produce that was then being sold at these farmers markets. And Italians mostly controlled the markets themselves. Chinese people would come and buy the groceries there, buy the produce, and then they had poles and baskets, and they would climb up the hills of San Francisco, those very steep hills, with their produce hanging off their baskets from their shoulders, and bring it door to door so that people who maybe didn't know these vegetables would still get to try them. And I love that story. I love their postcards of these little men with their heavy baskets climbing up very steep hills. And I'm so taken aback by that.
Other fascinating part of the book was the significance of some of the great hotels and restaurants in San Francisco, particularly that period of sudden wealth. Obviously, the Palace Hotel and then the St. Francis Hotel.
Right.
And I know that the chef, Victor Hertzler, from the St. Francis, wrote a cookbook in 1910,
yes.
which was a menu for a year for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's over 1,000 recipes,
amazing.
And not one menu repeated for a year.
Yeah. Well, he knew what he was doing.
He knew what he was doing, and he was using seasonal ingredients.
That's right. And he's one of the people who made concrete what San Francisco would be known for in the whole 20th century. He picked the dishes that then became seen as San Francisco dishes. So a good example of that is crab louis or shrimp louis, which we had today as a wonderful treat. That it was started actually at a French restaurant called Frank's Rotisserie, and the chef Louis Coutard, who came up with this very creamy but also spicy sauce that is traditional with it, he came up with it in the beginning of the 20th century, and then the earthquake happened. And 3 of the French restaurants from before the earthquake, the Poodle Dog, which is very famous, and Frank's Rotisserie and the Berger's, also a French restaurant, they worked together after the earthquake to become the Berger's Frank's Poodle Dog restaurant, which is obviously a name that was come up with by French committee of these French strong-willed restaurateurs. And the famous chef from Frank's, Louis Coutard, had died in 1908, right before the new restaurant opened. But they put his dish, crab leg à la Louis, on that menu when the new French restaurant opened. And it was a very popular French restaurant because it was the best of the pre-earthquake French restaurants all together in one place. And so that's when it first took off as a San Francisco dish. And Victor Hertzler put it in his cookbook as well, but he called it crab à la Louise. He made it more feminine, and he took out the spice. So I guess that's why he made it more feminine, that it was more accessible if it wasn't so spicy. And then at the Panama Pacific International Exposition, which was in 1915, we're coming up on the centennial of that actually, that was this great moment. The Panama Canal had finally been carved, and people could come through without either going by train or going all the way around Cape Horn. It really opened up the West Coast. And San Francisco got the honor of hosting this great international exposition. And they had a cookbook that came out of the Panama Pacific International Exposition. And in this cookbook, it had a recipe for crab louis, which had ketchup instead of the chili sauce. So again, they're trying to make it more accessible to all of America, to middle America that was going to be coming in and seeing that San Francisco was open again for business and for tourism. And that's a wonderful moment when they really start to sell a story of San Francisco as a food city, even if it means dumbing down the food a little bit to make it accessible.
And then there was a period because of the Depression in 29 and then the Second World War, where there was food rationing, things changed quite a bit. And then also modern food technology with heavy marketing changed how the average household cooked. But then you start seeing in the 50s, where, as you point out in the book, that Khan's opens in Chinatown,
Yeah,
and
Johnny Khan.
there's this new emergence of ethnic restaurants and finer restaurants that finally coming back that San Franciscans are accepting and welcoming.
That's right.
And that continues that brings us into the 60s, the Bohemian period as well. Can you talk about the Bohemian a little bit?
When you talk about San Francisco and Bohemians, you have to go back to the turn of the 20th century. Clarence Edwards wrote this great book, Bohemian San Francisco, and he's talking about really the same attitude, the same live and let live. We don't need to spend a lot of money on our food. We can still have great food. But he brings together under that umbrella of Bohemian all sorts of different cultures and ethnicities. He actually has the first sashimi that's written about in America that I've been able to find is in San Francisco in 1902. And we don't usually think of sashimi being eaten in San Francisco, but there were Japanese people who had come
Of course.
to be workers in San Francisco, and they were eating the foods that they thought of as familiar to them. And Clarence Edwards, as the San Francisco Chronicle's food writer, went to all these wonderful restaurants, and he wrote about that. And that was a missed opportunity for San Francisco to become known for sashimi early on. But the moment that you're talking about in the 60s is very interesting as well, that people have more money to spend than they did during the harder times, and they're interested in food, just like during the gold rush. And they're interested in local produce and showing off what they're able to do at home. With Julia Child being so famous nationally, people are really interested in cooking, and Williams Sonoma gets started and teaching people that they can make very sophisticated food in their home, as long as the ingredients are the right ingredients, which is what the Bay Area is known for.
And then that brings us into the 70s and 80s, where a lot of young Americans who were able to take the summer and travel abroad and discover food and want to recreate those foods here, were opening restaurants such obviously as Alice Waters and
Right.
Mark Miller, and they were seeking out, I think, the ethnic community to grow certain produce.
Yes, that's right. Alice Waters definitely reaches out to people from all different ethnicities. But I think one part of the story that often doesn't get remembered is that Cecilia Chang was doing the same thing from the Chinese side. So it's not always white people going and finding the ethnic food, but it's also a Chinese woman looking around at what produce is available and how can I make it in an elegant, delicious way. And she brought the idea of Chinese food not having to be chop suey, Cantonese, low-end food, but a very high-end experience from northern China.
Yeah. And then Mark Miller did the same thing with the Latin community as well, the Latin.
What's funny about this moment is actually the Mission Burrito gets started at the same time. So it's sort of the opposite experience. It's not high-end, but it's very San Francisco.
Yeah.
This big tube burrito. Because the Bohemians needed a meal that was cheap and filling, so they were happy to go into a new ethnic neighborhood, the Mission, and spend $2, back then even $1, to get a huge tube that would be a meal for tonight and for tomorrow night.
Can you tell us a little bit about the culinary historians of Northern California?
I'd be delighted to talk about my group. I founded it in 2004 with a professor at San Francisco State named Sally Scully, and we just wanted an opportunity to bring in speakers who were interested in food history and exchange ideas. So although we're located here, we don't just study San Francisco food, which is why there was no book when I got started. So we have people who work on chocolate, we have people who work on Indian food, any kind of cuisine that you can think of. And we usually meet once a month, often at Omnivore Books, which is a wonderful bookstore that focuses on food books right in Noe Valley in San Francisco. And so we'll get a speaker in, we'll all sit around listening to them talk about their research, and then we take them out to dinner afterwards and get to know each other more informally over a nice meal. And it's been a wonderful experience running this group. I have to give my sourdough story.
Oh, please, yes.
Okay, so this is my biggest surprise from working on the book, is I came to San Francisco in the 1990s. I enjoyed eating sourdough. I went to Fisherman's Wharf. I had the whole experience. But I thought sourdough as a flavor went back to the gold rush because the famous bakers, Isidore Boudin is the founder of the Boudin Bakery, and he, in fact, was in San Francisco during the gold rush. So I believed, as I think most San Franciscans do, that the taste of sourdough goes back that far. But it turns out that nobody talks about a special sour flavor to the sourdough bread until the 20th century. In the 19th century, they use the same techniques. The sourdough technique, involving the bacteria and the yeast and harnessing it, is wonderful, but you can make the end result taste however you want it to taste. In the 19th century, they made it taste like a sweet French bread, what we now think of as the French bread version of a delicious crusty loaf, but not sour. If it came out sour, you'd done something wrong. But in the 20th century, especially after the earthquake, when they're trying to figure out a way to bring tourism to San Francisco, they amp up the sourness and start marketing this idea that we have a tang, there's a tang to our bread. You should come to San Francisco and taste it here. It's only here in San Francisco. And it works. It's a simple story, and it gets picked up in travel magazines, and then you can buy sourdough bread at the airport before you leave to bring it home. Sooner or later, they start shipping San Francisco sourdough bread across the country. And it turns out you could make it taste however you want it to taste, whether you're in New York or Italy. The same bacteria are in the air. There's a particular bacteria that's called now the San Francisco bacteria, but you can find that little guy anywhere. And it's just fascinating to me that a taste, there's obviously, it feels more sophisticated to like your bread a little on the sour side. And so the city was able to make a lot of successful marketing out of that, along with Crab Louie and Cioppino and some other favorite San Francisco flavors. But I like living here now, where we have even more diversity of experience, culinary experiences.
Well, for somebody who's had a San Francisco starter for 30 years, I've never heard of that story.
Yeah,
so that's fascinating.
That's what I came up with for my book, so it's new.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's very fun.